Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On this episode, we're joined by Frank Vaisvilas. Frank covers Indigenous affairs for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. He just joined the Sentinel after 3 years at the Green Bay Press-Gazette as part of Report for America. Wisconsin is home to 11 Native American tribes, so there's a lot to cover. Frank is a graduate of Columbia College of Chicago and worked for multiple Chicago area papers. Hi, Frank.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
Sure. So what's your journalism origin story?
I grew up in Cicero, Illinois. It's kind of infamous for being a place where Al Capone kind of hung out and had his headquarters, and it was kind of run by the mob up until then. Actually, the administration there was known for being corrupt and stealing funds, and it was through reporting and local reporting that a lot of us residents were made aware of a lot of what was going on, and how funds are being stolen from the town, and that eventually led to the village president being arrested, and a lot of officials were charged, and the state took over the town for a while, clean up the mess that was left there. So I really admired journalists for really going after it in my hometown there, and that was in the 90s. I was also in high school at that time, and I admired some writers, became particularly fond of writing, and some of the SES like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Those are two writers I really looked up to in high school and wanted to kind of emulate, and they did their own type of journalism back in the 19th century. So that's pretty much how I got started. And I asked my high school English teacher what could I do, what career should I take in writing, and how do I become a journalist. She mentioned Columbia College, and that's where I went and just went from there. So
On your Twitter bio, you list yourself as being Mexican, Yaqui, Lithuanian, Irish, American.
yeah,
That's the most demographically diverse list that I think that we have had in the 130 plus episodes that we've talked to people. Is there
right.
anything from your background, your heritage, that lend itself to storytelling?
Well, yeah, just the origins of my four grandparents being from those four places of the world, and the world events, and how they ended up in America as refugees and as immigrants. And my grandmother from my father's side, on the Irish side, he came during one of the famines in Ireland during the 1800s, and then his father from the Lithuanian side, they came over during the Russian Revolution, and they fought on the side of the Tsar, and they lost. So, and they fled the country here, and first they went to Canada, then they came to the U.S. And then from my mother's side, my grandfather is Mexican. He's one of those who crossed the border. He kind of lived on the border of Texas and Mexico, kind of going back and forth for different work, as worked on different ranches, and eventually ended up here in Chicago. And then from my grandmother, she's a Yaqui. Her parents had fled the Mexican Revolution, and they ended up in Chicago or Indiana first. And what happened there was my great grandfather would have stories. It's Francisco Trevino. He's the Yaqui. He would have stories about Pancho Villa, this revered hero in Mexican and in Mexican stories. He's like a Mexican legend. But to him, he said he was more like brutal. He's more like a tyrant, and he was brutal to in Indians mostly. He would send them to the front line as cannon fodder. So he would round up these Yaquis, such as my great grandfather, and send them on suicide missions. And then he was 17 when he was rounded up by Pancho Villa. Then he somehow escaped and just ran to the U.S. and became a refugee, and just moved to Chicago and the Chicago area, and that's how my family ended up in Chicago, and that's just everyone from different parts of the world just converged in Chicago, and that's how we all met. I'm a product of that. So
Were they all storytellers?
somewhat, yeah. Well, yeah, they would. My mother and my father, they would tell stories about their family, and my grandparents once in a while. But yeah, but you would have to really ask them and kind of prod them for information. But yeah, that yeah. So that's maybe it's one of the early lessons in asking questions, I guess, and interviewing. So
So I'm looking at some of your career highlights, and I saw one thing that was referenced in your writer bio on the Journal-Sentinel website. Vaisvilas helped transform a shopper into an award-winning community newspaper with hard-hitting enterprise reporting, a professional redesign, and the introduction of several sections. What did you do, and how did you do it?
but that shopper was owned by Lee Enterprises. It was called the Valley Free Press. It was in southern DeKalb County, Illinois. There's probably like 20 small towns that it went to in that county, the biggest of which being Plano and Sandwich. And we were using Quark at that time, and I had taken several courses at Columbia in Quark design. So I was given the task of redesigning it and using a lot of just borrowing graphic elements from different papers. Just bought a bunch of different papers, including USA Today, which is a company I work for now. Borrowed a lot of design elements from USA Today, I recall. And just introducing other sections like the calendar section, pretty much all the sections I introduced. Comic section, my news section, my feature news section, and then I knew sports was big, such as high school football. Plano was a state champions one year. And my younger cousin, he was 18. He's pretty smart kid. He lived near the area, probably like 10 miles away from Plano. And I asked him to be my sports reporter, and he came on board, and we paid him like freelance dollars, $75 a story, and he would go cover games, and he did really well. And I edited his work a lot, and that ended up winning some sports awards at the Illinois Press Association that year. So yeah, that was pretty fun. That was my baby for a while. So
Nice. What are the highlights of your work for the Tribune and the Sun-Times?
there was a lot of quirky assignments that the editors would send me on, but mostly I became a weekend reporter. They would pay me like $500 for the weekend just to cover any breaking news, go after any, and I would cover mostly the south side of Chicago or southern Cook County, or so there was a lot of crime that would happen, and I would try to follow up on with families, survivors, and just call them up or even knock on our door sometimes, and if anybody would answer, if they wanted to talk about what happened, or like probably like 1 out of 5 times I would get somebody who would talk. So a lot of that was kind of stressful and hard, but it was my job, and I was just trying to tell people's story, and want to help give people a voice, and if they had anything to say, I want to give them an opportunity to say it and express what happened to them. So
Well, all right, so let's get to what you're doing now. How did you end up covering Indigenous affairs in Wisconsin?
sure. Well, one of my editors from the Chicago Tribune, he had left and was hired as a recruiter for Report for America, which is a nonprofit that kind of gathered up journalists from around the country and sends them on beats that are for undercovered beats that aren't really covered too often in the news, such as tribal affairs, which is very undercovered. A lot of major newspapers don't have a tribal news desk or anyone who covers tribal affairs. So that was intriguing to me, and just growing up in the city, kind of being like a city Indian. I mean, and just wanting to know more about my own background and heritage, and my grandfather as a Yaqui, and my mother in recent years wanting to know more about that too, and just kind of like doing the research and finding out more about where we came from. It's just fascinating. And then, in some friends here in Chicago, they would tell me they didn't even know that these tribes were up in Wisconsin. There's 11 federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin, but there's one that's not federally recognized. That's the Brothertown Indian nation, and they're still trying to gain federal recognition. But anyway, a lot of my friends here in Chicago, they thought like a reservation in Wisconsin, like up in northern Wisconsin, was basically like a big campground with you would drive through and you would still find teepees there and people living in teepees, like the old ways. Well, first of all, those are plain Indians. Most of the tribes in Wisconsin are from the woodlands, so they had like wigwams 200 years ago, but now they live in houses. And yeah, it was just I just thought it was fascinating a lot. I just thought it was a lot I could educate people on. People get so much wrong about the history of Native Americans and the interactions they've had with America, and just trying to correct that history and just trying to educate people. Thought that was great.
As you said, a lot of people have all sorts of misconceptions. And some of the stories that you've done are stories that people who are non-Indigenous would have no idea about. I'm just going to list a few. You won an award for a feature about a woman from the Ho-Chunk tribe that survived drug addiction. Now she's helping others. You talked to survivors of the Catholic Church and government's forced schooling and abuse of Native Americans in the 1950s. You did a piece, this one kind of different, how hardwood from the Menominee tribe was used on the Milwaukee Bucks home court. The citizens did a blessing on the floor, and a few years later, the Bucks won the championship.
Okay.
And then the wood was also used at the Lumberjack World Championships, which were held in Wisconsin. So that's a bunch. More recently, you reported on a tribe in Wisconsin looking to get into the cannabis business, tribes getting PPP loans, a Red Cliff tribe member that was a Pulitzer finalist. That's a long list. I'm looking at a page that lists your articles, and it lists a food article, a language article, a drugs article, a sports article, a history article, a military article. All that said, how do you come up with your story ideas?
Well, yeah, this is a beat that really encompasses everything, because tribal communities are everything. They run the gamut, and yeah, just looking for story ideas. Just I've been in this business since '05, really, so almost 20 years now. Just kind of getting to know what works and looking at the analytics sometimes over the years and knowing what gets the most page views, and yeah, just what's also the most interesting to me. And I think about those friends who had thought people still lived in teepees. What might they want to know more about? And yeah, I just think about the reader in that way and what people would want to know more about, and just trying to educate people. So.
I'm thinking too that something like the Milwaukee Bucks is a nice entry point for a lot of people. It allows them a way in to learn about the tribal culture where they can associate it with the Milwaukee Bucks. Or I imagine at some point there might be a story related to the Packers, because everyone you were at a newspaper where I imagine the Packers were A1 regularly. What are some of the stories that you're most proud of?
Well, just recently there was that blood quantum article that won an award from Report for America, so that was like a national award. I was kind of hesitant to approach that at first, because it's kind of a sensitive subject about because it kind of looks at the question as what makes an Indian an Indian. I had conversations with the then president of the Native American Journalists Association, asking him that my editors want me to write this article about blood quantum and kind of explain to people what's going on in Indian country. And he was saying, well, if it's not for Native people to read, if it's for everyone to read, then it's really not anyone's business but Native people's, and we shouldn't be writing about that. So that made me even more hesitant to go ahead. Then I spoke with other journalists, other Native journalists, experienced veteran journalists, and said I could approach it more as an explainer, just kind of what I've been doing anyway, just trying to educate people on what's happening and what's going on. And then I also want to approach it as Like this is something that the U.S. government imposed on tribes in the first place. This you have to be a certain percentage of blood quantum because like race and how much blood you have. This is like European concept. This is like a white people's concept of race, and then they kind of enforce that upon the tribes as well as a way to eventually dwindle the numbers because they knew that this so-called blood quantum would eventually get dwindled as there's intermarriages, other tribes with non-Indian people, and even some descendants are having trouble getting membership because, like for example, in Wisconsin, there's 6 bands of Ojibwe. They're all Ojibwe, but a descendant who might have a great grandparent in one band and a great grandparent in another band might meet the requirement of 25% blood quantum to be a member, but because their grandparents are from different bands, they don't because they count each band as a separate tribe, even though they're all Ojibwe. So that's one way how the government controls the tribal numbers, the population numbers. So I just took it from that point of view, just try to explain that more in depth.
So I'm curious too, it just hit me that is there a difference or a considerable difference between reporting on Native American and Indigenous issues in Wisconsin compared to if you were doing it in Oklahoma or another state that's further west, or are the the concepts behind the story is largely the same?
Oh, they do have somewhat different backgrounds about where they came from. Culture is a bit different, and I don't know. It just seems like, well, more out west, there's more tribes that have more pull or that are bigger, have more pull with the government. They're more, they probably have public relations departments. Here in Wisconsin, there's just a few tribes that have public information officers who I can go to first, but other tribes are pretty quiet and don't really talk to the media too much, so that makes it somewhat of a challenge at times. But yeah, I don't know. I would say each place is different. I don't know, but there are definitely some similarities. There are some issues in Indian country that appear everywhere, like mascots and everybody wants sovereignty and food sovereignty, energy sovereignty. Those are issues that keep coming up everywhere in Indian country. So.
And you mentioned thinking that people live in teepees, but what about in terms of journalists? What are the things that non-native journalists get wrong most often when they try to cover Indigenous affairs stories?
Almost that those same type of misconceptions. I know one journalist, like they would come to me asking me how do they contact the tribe. Oh well, call their public information officer, and they would come back surprised. They have a public information officer, or just how or about the tribal health department. They would think that it's not like a regular health clinic. They would think they would use some sort of Indian medicine to help heal COVID or something. but instead of and they didn't realize that they had the vaccine up there and that they were administering it to tribal members. So and they had real doctors as well. So
okay, that's unfortunate. What's the hardest part of the job for you?
Probably waiting for people to get back to me. At sometimes I know people joke there's people are in Indian time, they get back to me on Indian time, but if they say they're gonna get back to me, I might wait. If I got an interview scheduled at 2 o'clock, I might not actually get to speak to them for like 4 or 5 o'clock, or yeah, just waiting for people to get back to me, just like with journalism, just like it was in Chicago as well. Just waiting to get a hold of sources, but once you get a hold of them and I'm relieved that I got the story, and then I could look forward to writing it, and then I'm all good again. But yeah, that's probably the most anxious and stressful part, just waiting to get the information.
What's the best part of the job?
Is writing it, I think, sometimes, usually, because some of these stories kind of just write themselves. it just feels just putting it together, putting a story together, and also I would say probably reader feedback sometime too, when when readers like your stories and kind of feel good about that. You want to, I mean, you talk to them about it, so or they want to know more, so you try to answer them.
So what's the process? You mentioned writing being the best part of the job. Stories write themselves. What's the process of writing like for you?
Well, I think I put most emphasis into the lead, and everyone has a different writing process, but for me, it's I've always been taught that the lead is the most important, and then everything kind of just flows from there. And I used to write how we used to write in journalism with the inverted pyramid, have everything, the most important information on top, and then it kind of goes down. We can, well, the least important stuff goes on the bottom. But now in these recent years, I've been looking to include more pertinent information throughout the story, and then have a good kicker at the end too, and just keep it interesting, like a good flowing story throughout, and where nothing is wasted. Just keep it tight, trying not to put any useless information in there. So
Okay.
yeah.
So how do you view your role as a journalist in 2023?
We were just talking about this in one of our trainings at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel as well. We just started doing solutions journalism, and one thing I kind of brought up is that, you know, back in the day, like in the 80s and 90s, journalists were known as like producing a lot of poverty porn. Like they would go into bad neighborhoods and not just report about the crime and the drug use and all the bad stuff, and about nothing else really. So I think our goal is to be different than that. I mean, we still got to report what the news that happens, but also report on the positive stories, and also trying to use stories as to give people a voice of empowerment, like to find someone in those communities who are trying to make a difference, and how it's working, and kind of feature them more, and just try to lift them up some more, and kind of create these, or just try to give empowerment to these voices in the community, who are people who are trying to make a difference, and just reporting all the things that are working as well to make things better. So
Presenting a more complete perspective,
right.
essentially. And how has being a journalist, how does that influence how you view the world?
Well, in that way, I mean, I'd say probably with the Tribune and Sun-Times covering those weekend crime and death numbers, that's probably, be a cynic after a while, but just working on feature stories like this and kind of really talking to people, and there's a lot more optimism, I think, and you see what people are doing. You meet some really interesting people who are trying to make a difference, and yeah, I think that's probably the main way, I think.
Who's the most interesting person you've ever written about?
Oh man.
You walked right into that question.
Right. I was just recently in Wisconsin. I don't know, I'm kind of admiring like the Oneida Nation chairman, Tahasi Hill, and what he's doing up there in Oneida. There are these ladies who run the Wise Women Gathering place also in Oneida. There's teachers, and there's Wayne Valier. He's a Ojibwe up in Lac du Flambeau, trying to revive the Ojibwe arts and language and culture there. He figured out how to build a birch bark canoe. He won some national award for that. There's a lot of artists up there too, like Karen Ann Hoffman. She's Oneida. She does some amazing beadwork. Yeah, I would say a lot of artists probably.
So in looking through the various things that you've covered, you mentioned interesting people, and there's another podcaster, Jeff Pearlman, who does this sometimes. He'll go way back in someone's archives and try and find a really interesting, unusual, or goofy story that they did. And I think here's an interesting person. You did a story in 2018 about a high school graduate who was on a 5,000-day streak of wearing dinosaur shirts. What was that about?
I think it was something off a Facebook post. something he posted on Facebook that either myself or one of the editors was kind of monitoring the school's Facebook or. But yeah, because he was just kind of a cool kid. He just loved dinosaurs ever since watching Jurassic Park, and he made it a habit always to wear dinosaurs on his shirts ever since he was a kid, and just realized he was on a streak and just kept it going throughout his teenage years. And yeah, he wants to study those kind of genetics too. His goal was to try to bring back a dinosaur actually in college, and he thinks that what's done in Jurassic Park it was simplified, but he thinks that it could be done scientifically to bring.
Wow, you cover a lot of serious stuff. That's a nice lighter kind of piece. How do you manage your mental health?
I watch a lot of Netflix, and I don't know, just like a lot of escapism like that. But I don't know, it's not so serious these days as it had been. I do think about these stories a lot. It's just kind of become a part of me. If I have a good idea or think of a good source, it could be late at night. I might get up and write it down, or someone might be trying to reach me, or another reporter also reaches me after hours, and I'll talk with them. I don't know. And I just was recently married. She's helping to keep me grounded, I think, a little bit, and so she's great. So yeah, my wife, I think, is pretty good for me.
No, that's very good. What would you like to tell us about the future work that you're considering at the moment?
We just won a grant from the Portland Institute to look at environmental reporting in the Great Lakes, and one of my ideas was to show how tribal treaty rights can help protect the environment, and how tribes are using those rights in court to successfully argue in keeping the environment protected. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That's one project we're working on. We're also working on pretendians, who kind of change race, who pretend that they're Native Americans in order to advance their career or obtain grants or scholarships and any other benefits, now that being Native these days is cooler and than it had been. And yeah, and I'm looking to eventually write a book about this beat. I know a lot of academics, scholars reached out to me. They want me to write some sort of history book, but there's a lot of history books already about the tribes in Wisconsin and the Midwest and everywhere. I would like to write more about the tribal fight for sovereignty and the modern era. In Wisconsin, we have Act 31, which is a mandate to teach Native American history in public schools, and a lot of kids don't know some of the recent history, such as the Walleye Wars up in northern Wisconsin, where there were fights over spearfishing rights with the Ojibwe people, and just kind of getting more. Just want to write more about that, about the tribal sovereignty rights. So
cool. That's great. I will add that in. In fact, I'm going to now say, all right, so the show is called The Journalism Salute. We salute you for your good work, and we ask that you do likewise. Is there a journalist or journalism organization that you would like to salute for their good work?
Well, I would definitely salute Report for America. I'm seeing a lot of good work come out of there, and a lot of good journalists kind of grow. And so yeah, definitely Report for America, I think.
How do they do in terms of teaching? And I know that you get assigned like a mentor. How does that help?
Well, they have these virtual training courses every month. There's probably like 5 a month, and you can just kind of choose what you want to learn more about. You kind of look an hour, 2 hours, some of them 3 hours, writing workshops, and you learn from some of the best in the field. So they just kind of help set those up.
Cool. Frank Vaisvilas, thank you for taking the time to join us. Best of luck. We will be following your work closely.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter @JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.